I wasn't looking for a cover-up when I started this. I was looking for a paper trail. Specifically, I was trying to trace what happened to physical specimens collected during the great American archaeological surveys of the 1870s and 1880s, the government-funded expeditions that fanned out across the continent after the Civil War to document what was actually out there. Bones, artifacts, burial mounds, stone structures that didn't fit the settlement timelines textbooks claimed. I wanted to know where the physical evidence ended up, because evidence that gets collected but never displayed, never debated, never publicly examined tends to tell a more interesting story than the evidence that does. What I found wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and, I think, more disturbing. A pattern of institutional decisions, each one individually defensible, that together produced a single outcome: the systematic removal of anomalous human remains from public discourse. Not through destruction, at least not entirely. Through reclassification, through bureaucratic fog, through the institutional equivalent of filing something in a drawer and losing the key. The Smithsonian institution was chartered by Congress in 1846. Its founding mission, inscribed in the original legislation, was the increase and diffusion of knowledge. That's the phrase they use. Increase and diffusion. Not increase and selective retention. Not increase and diffusion among those who already agree with the existing framework. Just knowledge, full stop. By 1879, the Smithsonian had established its Bureau of Ethnology, later renamed the Bureau of American Ethnology, with a specific mandate to document the archaeology and anthropology of the North American continent. John Wesley Powell, the same man who had run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, became its first director. Powell was brilliant, pragmatic, and deeply committed to a particular framework for understanding North American prehistory. That framework would shape what the Bureau collected, what it catalogued, and crucially, what it chose to do with what didn't fit. The surveys began almost immediately, and what they found in the mound regions of the Midwest and Southeast was extraordinary by any standard. The mound builders, whoever they actually were, had constructed earthworks across the Ohio and Mississippi river valleys that rivaled anything in the ancient world for scale and geometric precision. Serpent Mound in Ohio stretches a quarter mile. The Cahokia complex in Illinois covers 6 square miles. These weren't random earthen piles. They were precisely engineered, astronomically aligned, built with reference to sightlines and solar events that required sophisticated mathematical understanding. And inside, many of them were remains. The reports that came back to Washington from the Bureau's field agents in the 1880s and 1890s described skeletal material that the agents themselves found puzzling. Not in every case. Most of the remains were within the size range one would expect. But the anomalous cases were documented with enough consistency across enough independent surveyors working in enough different states that they cannot be explained as simple measurement error or regional exaggeration. Cyrus Thomas, who directed the mound survey for the Bureau, published the comprehensive study in 1894, a 730-page report called Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology. It is a meticulous document. It is also a document that is careful, in the way that institutional documents are careful, about what conclusions it draws from the anomalous data it contains. The newspaper record is less careful, because newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s were not writing for institutional posterity. They were writing for readers who wanted to know what had been found. The New York Times ran a piece in December 1882 describing the excavation of a burial mound in Moundsville, West Virginia, where a skeleton measuring 7 feet and 9 inches in length had been unearthed. The paper described the bones as those of a giant, noted that the skull was of unusual thickness, and reported that the remains had been examined by a physician who confirmed the measurements. This was not a sensational tabloid. This was the newspaper of record. The Dunkirk Evening Observer in 1882 reported skeletal remains from a mound in Ohio measuring over 8 feet. The Rockford Daily Register in Illinois reported similarly proportioned remains from a burial site along the Rock River in 1883. The Daily Milwaukee News covered a discovery in Wisconsin in 1891. Remains from a mound complex near Lake Mills that excavators described as belonging to individuals of extraordinary physical stature. These weren't fringe publications running unverified rumors. These were the regional papers of record covering discoveries that were happening in their own backyards, reported by correspondents who were physically present, sometimes alongside Smithsonian-affiliated surveyors who were filing their own reports back to Washington. Here is the question that eventually made me put down the newspaper archive and pick up the institutional correspondence instead. Where did the bones go? Because they went somewhere. The Bureau didn't leave skeletal material in the field. Standard procedure was to collect, transport, and catalogue. The specimens were sent to Washington. Some went to the Army Medical Museum, which had its own collection of unusual skeletal material built during the Civil War. Some went to the Smithsonian's physical anthropology collections. And then, in most cases, involving anomalous remains, something interesting happened. They stopped being anomalous. Not because new measurements contradicted the original ones, because the original documentation became difficult to find. Catalogue numbers were reassigned, field notes were separated from the specimens they described. The chain of physical custody, which should have been meticulously maintained for scientific material, developed gaps. I want to be specific here because specificity is what separates investigation from speculation. The Smithsonian's own records, accessible through the National Anthropological Archives, show significant discrepancies between the number of skeletal specimens field agents reported collecting during the mound surveys of the 1880s and 1890s, and the number of specimens that can be verified as currently present in the collections. The Smithsonian itself acknowledged in a 1987 letter to a researcher requesting access to giant skeleton documentation that some specimens from the mound survey era could not be located. Could not be located. That is a specific phrase that someone typed into a specific letter in 1987 about physical specimens that government employees collected on government-funded expeditions, transported to a government institution, and catalogued using government resources. Specimens whose existence was documented in contemporaneous field reports, newspaper accounts, and Smithsonian's own internal correspondence. Specimens that, in several cases, were described as so significant that the field agent specifically noted they were being set aside for further scientific study. Could not be located. I want to talk about what institutional disappearance actually looks like, because it's nothing like what people imagine. It doesn't require a secret room, a shadowy committee, or a coordinated conspiracy with minutes and membership rolls. It requires something far more mundane and far more durable, the slow application of bureaucratic discretion to inconvenient material. Here is how it works in practice. A field agent collects skeletal remains and assigns them a field catalogue number. He notes the unusual size in his field journal. He ships the specimens to Washington. They arrive and are assigned an accession number by the receiving department. But the receiving clerk, working from a physical description rather than the original field notes, records dimensions that are perhaps slightly different from those in the original report. A clerical error. A matter of the original measurements being taken with different reference points or at a different point of articulation. The discrepancy is noted internally and then not noted again. The specimen is filed. Years pass. The Bureau of Ethnology reorganizes. The Army Medical Museum collection is partially transferred to the Smithsonian. Catalogue numbers don't transfer cleanly between institutions. Some records are consolidated, others are simply refiled. The connection between field notes from an 1887 survey and a specific specimen in a drawer in a Washington building grows weaker with each administrative transition. By 1920, someone looking for that specimen needs to know not just what it is, but what accession number it received, which institution originally processed it, and which of several reorganizations in which it might have been caught. By 1960, that chain of knowledge is held, if it is held at all, by people who are aging out of their positions without transferring it in written form. By 1980, it is genuinely lost, in the sense that no single living person can reconstruct the path from field report to current location. This is not conspiracy, this is bureaucracy. And the thing about bureaucracy is that it is directional. It loses things that institutions are not actively working to preserve, and it preserves things that institutions actively want preserved. The Smithsonian spent considerable institutional energy in the late 19th and early 20th century on a specific question: who built the mounds? The answer that emerged from Powell's bureau, the answer that became the official position, was that the mound builders were the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, not a separate vanished civilization, not a race of giants, not evidence of a pre-Columbian contact with advanced Old World cultures. This was the correct scientific consensus position as it stood in 1894. It is largely still the position today, and in its broad strokes it is almost certainly right. But the way a scientific consensus is established matters as much as the conclusion it reaches, and the process by which anomalous data gets incorporated into, or excluded from, a consensus framework is exactly where institutional bias most reliably operates. Powell's bureau needed the mound builder question settled because the alternative, a prolonged public debate about whether a vanished race of physically unusual people had constructed the earthworks of the American interior, was creating political complications. The mound builder mythology had been weaponized throughout the 19th century to argue that Native Americans were not the original inhabitants of the land, that a superior vanished race had preceded them, and that the displacement of native peoples was therefore not a moral crime but a repetition of an earlier process. This was racist pseudoscience in service of land theft, and Powell was right to oppose it. But in opposing the mythology, the Bureau also developed a strong institutional incentive to regard any evidence that might be seen as supporting it, including anomalous skeletal remains from mound contexts, as an inconvenience to be managed rather than data to be examined. The specimens didn't need to be actively destroyed, though some may have been. They just needed to not be prominently displayed, not be widely published, not be made easily available for independent examination by researchers who might draw different conclusions. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, created a new framework governing the treatment of Native American remains held by federal institutions and institutions receiving federal funding. NAGPRA, as it is known, was a genuine moral corrective to a century of treating indigenous human remains as scientific property rather than as the ancestors of living peoples who had every right to claim them. It also, as a practical matter, created an institutional mechanism that made it significantly harder to independently examine skeletal material in federal collections. I am not arguing that NAGPRA was wrong. I am noting that its implementation coincided with the period during which researchers were requesting access to anomalous specimens from the mound survey era, and that the combination of restricted access and degraded documentation made the question of where specific specimens actually were essentially unanswerable. In 1991, a researcher named Richard Dewhurst began requesting documentation from the Smithsonian related to giant skeletal finds reported in the Bureau of Ethnology's own field records. The correspondence produced a response pattern: acknowledgement that the records existed, requests for specific catalogue numbers the researcher could not supply because the catalogue numbers were the information being requested, and eventual responses suggesting the specimens could not be located. The specific phrase, "could not be located," again. Dewhurst published his findings in 2014 in a book called The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America. The Smithsonian's response was not to produce the specimens and demonstrate his conclusions were wrong. It was a statement calling his work inconsistent with the scientific evidence, without specifying which evidence, which specimens, or which analysis contradicted his documentation. An institution with physical possession of the specimens could end this debate in an afternoon, produce the bones, measure them, publish the measurements. If the field reports were exaggerated, the matter would be closed. The specimens cannot be located. I keep returning to a specific set of Bureau of Ethnology field reports from the surveys of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois conducted between 1884 and 1890. The agents who produced these reports, Gerard Folk, James Middleton, Thomas Wilson, were not credulous amateurs. They were trained surveyors working under institutional oversight, filing reports they knew would be reviewed by Powell and his staff. The professional consequences of gross inaccuracy would have been significant. These were not men who had careers to spare on sensational exaggeration. Folk's report from the Ohio surveys describes excavation of a mound near Chillicothe, in which skeletal remains were found at the primary burial level that he estimated, based on long bone length, to represent individuals of between 6 feet 10 inches and 7 feet 4 inches in height. He noted that these measurements were taken in the field before significant post-depositional compression could be precisely accounted for, and that the actual living stature may have been somewhat different in either direction. He did not claim to have found 10-foot giants. He described a careful estimate of above average but not fantastical size, and he noted it as an anomaly worth further study. That qualification, worth further study, is the phrase that haunts this investigation, because further study requires access to the specimens, and the specimens cannot be located. What I find most interesting about the architectural parallel, and this connects to a pattern that has appeared in other investigations I've pursued, is that the mound survey era overlaps almost precisely with the construction period of the large-scale neoclassical government buildings that were going up across American cities in the same decades. Buildings with interior proportions that are notably generous by the standards of average human scale. Courthouses and administrative buildings from the 1870s through the 1890s with corridor ceilings at 14 feet, interior doorways at 10, staircases with risers spaced for a stride considerably longer than a contemporary human's comfortable step. I am not claiming a direct connection. I am noting the overlap and observing that the same institutional apparatus that was making decisions about skeletal remains in the 1880s was also making decisions about the built environment in the 1880s, and that the official explanations for both, grandeur in the case of the architecture, administrative error in the case of the missing specimens, are individually plausible and collectively inadequate. The Library of Congress contains in its general collection several dozen volumes of newspaper clippings assembled by a private researcher in the 1970s, catalogued under the heading of Anomalous Anthropological Finds, North America, 1860 to 1920. The researcher's name is not prominently recorded. The finding aid describes the collection as of potential historical interest, but unverified. The clippings themselves, when examined, show a consistent pattern. Mainstream newspaper reporting of skeletal discoveries throughout the mound regions, consistent with the field reports from the Bureau of Ethnology surveys describing remains of unusual size, and then, in most cases, no follow-up reporting of any kind. The specimens were collected, sent to Washington, and the story stopped. Not because there was nothing further to report, because the institutional framework that might have produced further reports had moved on. Powell's Bureau had its answer on the mound builder question. The political pressure to settle that question had been satisfied. The anomalous specimens were in Washington, and Washington had other concerns. In 1906, the American Antiquities Act gave the federal government authority over archaeological material on federal land. The result is that bones already collected exist in a regulatory environment controlling access and limiting independent verification, while the legal framework for collecting new specimens from the same mound contexts has become extraordinarily restrictive. You cannot go out and re-excavate the Chillicothe mound to verify Folk's field measurements. The site is protected. The original specimens are in Washington, and Washington cannot locate them. The institutional loop is closed. I have been in the reading room of the National Anthropological Archives twice. It is a quiet space, attended by professional archivists who are genuinely helpful within the limits of what they can access. On my second visit, I asked one of them, not accusingly, simply as a practical question, what happens when a researcher can document from field reports that a specific specimen was collected and sent to the institution, but cannot find a current catalogue record for it? She thought about it for a moment. She said that with material from the late 19th century surveys, gaps in the catalogue record were not unusual, that multiple reorganisations of the collections over more than a century meant that some material was genuinely unlocatable, and that unlocatable was not the same as destroyed, because destruction would have required authorization and documentation that usually didn't exist either. She paused, and then she said something I have thought about since. She said that the honest answer was that they didn't always know what they had, and that not knowing what you had was different from knowing what you had and hiding it, but that from the outside those two things could look very similar. That is the most precise description of the situation I have encountered anywhere in this investigation. Not knowing what you have. That is the Smithsonian's position, stated by a professional archivist with no stake in either side of this question. Not knowing what they have in an institution whose founding mandate was the increase and diffusion of knowledge about specimens collected with federal funding by federal employees under federal oversight from sites now federally protected and unavailable for independent re-examination. The one category of historical record that would resolve this, an independent scientific examination of the specific specimens described in the field reports, is precisely what the accumulated weight of institutional decisions has made impossible to conduct. The newspapers are still there, the field reports are still there, the correspondence is still there, the catalogue gaps are still there, the bones are somewhere, and the only institution positioned to find them has one job. So far, they have not done it.